truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, October 18th, 2024, the 1,367th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by checking the show notes or visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. Now, before we get started, yesterday I said it was the 1,367th day of dystopia. Turns out we were only on 1,366. So apologies on that, but I just can't give out bonus days. There are no bonus days in dystopia. You cannot get off the roller coaster while it's in motion. You're just going to have to grin and bear it until the end of the ride. But the good news is we're going to make it through. Now, if you've been listening to the show for any significant amount of time, you've probably heard me go through some of this before. I've been making the case I'm about to present for a long time and hearing people get upset at me for doing it for just as long. And the case I'm referring to is how I see things shaping up in regards to this fake election and how we work our way through these different scenarios that might emerge in reality. And I've tried to guide my analysis with the understanding that our elections are fake. Not just that there's a little fraud, but that outcomes are decided. I've said many times that if elections are fake, all that matters is the battle of narratives. Everything will come down to the court of public opinion. What is the public prepared to believe about who the country would actually choose were elections to be real? In 2020, we had a fake election. We had an election that was obviously rigged and stolen. There's no reason to believe that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. There's not even a reason to believe it's possible. But people accepted it because they didn't think a stolen election was possible. And they thought maybe the television was right. Maybe Trump is causing all of this discord. Everyone certainly knows people in their lives experiencing extreme Trump derangement. And those sorts of people tend to make things difficult and uncomfortable all the time. People wanted that feeling to go away, and they were told, they believed, that if Donald Trump was out of the picture and his supporters just settled down, everything would go back to how it was before. They were told the adults would be back in the room, there would be a return to decency, and after the very deadly pandemic and the summer of love, and the Russia hoax and the impeachment hoax and the Stormy Daniels hoax and the rest of it, they figured maybe it's not worth it. We'll just let them have Biden for 4 years. How bad can it be? And then we'll get things back on track with a normal Republican 4 years from now. Their favorite TV characters told them they were going to get in trouble if they told the big lie, which meant asking any questions about the election. There were all sorts of social pressures. Around January 6th, people didn't want to be called conspiracy theorists. They didn't want to be called insurrectionists. They didn't want to be associated with political violence. And all of that is understandable if any of that was true. It's not true, and most people now know that it's not true. Those of us who were saying there's no way Joe Biden won this election from his basement turned out to be right. And everything that's happened since only really makes any sense if you view it through that lens. People didn't understand that then. Everything was confusing. They hadn't looked into how elections work. They didn't realize the government was that corrupt, and they didn't want to stand up and fight for the country, for Donald Trump, for fair elections, for any of it. People wanted to tune out and focus on their daily lives, which is an understandable motivation if your country hasn't just been usurped. Turns out that a usurpation of the most powerful country in the world is actually kind of threatening to everyone. And in just over a year, we had vaccine mandates, the Afghanistan withdrawal, and Putin's very brutal invasion into Ukraine. You add that to everything else people have witnessed over the last 4 years, and there are far fewer people who are going to be unwilling to stand up and speak out if and when this quote-unquote election is rigged and stolen, which means little more than the television announces that Kamala Harris won. And the point is, it would be a lot harder to win in the court of public opinion this time around for Kamala Harris than it was for Joe Biden in 2020. All the stories about Trump and his supporters and how dangerous and racist and stupid they are have failed. I'm not saying there's no one left who believes them. I'm saying that they no longer have the power to convince. People who are convinced will keep consuming it. It's their 2 minutes hate from George Orwell's 1984. They need that because it keeps them going. But everyone who's relaxed a bit and thought their way through these issues thinks, oh, these people are crazy now. So if elections are rigged and elections are fake, then all that matters is winning a battle of narratives to win in the court of public opinion. Winning more fake numbers than your opponent isn't even a coherent idea. But the thing is, if elections are totally real, if every vote is real, if it's cast and processed in a lawful way, it's cast by an American and everything is properly tabulated and reported, then the winner of that real election would be the winner in the court of public opinion, and those results would reflect a victory in the battle of narratives. So either way, whether elections are real or they're fake, All that ultimately matters is the battle of narratives, winning in the court of public opinion. Now, if you're not convinced by that, that's fine. The people who steal elections know that's true, which is why you see such an elaborate media operation. They're not trying to convince people to vote for Kamala Harris because it's in their best interest. They're trying to convince the country that it's a close race, that Kamala Harris could win, and there are reasons to believe that Kamala Harris is doing really well. It's not like they haven't done this successfully before. And so you have to keep all this in mind when you're thinking about what might happen in this fake election and its aftermath and what comes next. And the other thing I focus on is understanding our best case scenario and their best case scenario. What do things look like from the perspective of the regime? It's too easy to say they just want Kamala Harris to win. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. If they'd achieved some great success in the battle of narratives, they would simply present Kamala Harris as the winner, knowing that the country would accept it. That's what they did with some success in 2020. If they were actually successful, people would have just recognized Joe Biden's legitimacy the entire time, and we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. They may have thought it would work, but it didn't really work. They were able to hold on until January 6th, and then everything became about the very violent insurrection, and at that point, a lot of people simply surrendered. That's not going to work this time, because even with propaganda and censorship, all the money they could ever spend, the assistance of every old guard institution, and even AI, they're not going to be able to sell the country on the idea that Kamala Harris somehow dominated Donald Trump. I'm sure there are players on that side who think that's possible, and others who understand it simply isn't. But even if they decided it was possible, it's still not their best case scenario, because what they would have is a much larger population of people who are prepared to go to bat for Donald Trump than they faced in 2020. People already understand there is something seriously wrong with our elections. If that were to happen, a process similar to what came after 2020 over the next few months would destroy the election fraud apparatus for good. They would no longer be able to choose who wins in elections all the way across the country, from president down to the House and Senate at the federal level, all the way down to governors, state legislatures, county officials, local officials, right down to your school boards. And if that were to happen, their entire system would collapse. The illusion of legitimacy for the government is upheld by the illusion of legitimacy of our elections. It wouldn't be long after that people would understand their current officials can't prove their legitimacy in office either. And then what could they control? Their government would be null and void. So their best case scenario is not Kamala wins this election. Their best case scenario is to make sure there are as many uniparty politicians in office around the country and that the election fraud apparatus remains in place. And since 99% of the narrative focus during this fake election cycle has been on Donald Trump and the presidential race, they know they can achieve those goals, their real priorities, by simply throwing us a bone and having the television tell us that Donald Trump won. They would immediately begin to delegitimize him and his victory, and then they would use whatever legal means in their power to make sure he can never take office, whether it's disqualification under the 14th Amendment in the Congress, or objecting to electors, or whatever else they think they might be able to pull off. I've suggested before in an episode back in the spring called Unacceptable Results that I believe they might even throw Republicans a Larry Hogan or someone along those lines to convince the public that the elections are not rigged. Larry Hogan, Republican, won in deep blue Maryland. There's no way that could happen if Democrats were stealing elections. And of course, the people who realize our elections are rigged and stolen still think it's just the Democrats. It's not. It's the Uniparty. Elections are stolen for the Uniparty Left as they're stolen for the Uniparty Right. Winners are selected, and when those winners take office, they are going to support the Uniparty agenda. It doesn't matter which demographics they're marketing to and which brand they're selling. If you owned both Coke and Pepsi, you wouldn't care which one people preferred. You just wouldn't want them to drink anything other than Coke or Pepsi. If everyone one day decided that Coke is the worst, cool people drink Pepsi, You'd be like, yeah, Coke is the worst. Drink Pepsi. And if 5 or 10 years later, they decided that Pepsi is the worst, all the cool people drink Coke, you would be right there cheering them on. The regime cares about the Uniparty in America being able to implement their agenda. They don't care whether or not you think you're totally taking it to those communists or whether the communists totally think they're taking it to you. Their best case scenario is whatever scenario leaves that bureaucratic administrative state in place, preserves the election fraud apparatus so they can continue to choose winners and losers at every level all around the country, and to have enough uniparty power everywhere that they can thwart Donald Trump. Why would they care about Kamala Harris winning? They have other people they like better than Kamala Harris. I wouldn't be surprised if they're just happy to get her out of the way. So their best case scenario is something that most of MAGA thinks will be an enormous victory, an historic victory. And to be clear, if the TV says Trump won, I am happy to play that card. We're going to have to be happy to play whatever cards we're dealt. But the TV announcing that Donald Trump won a fake election is not just somehow game over for the global regime. It seems right now to be their best case scenario. If we hope to ever get ourselves out of this situation where everything in our country, all of our politics, all of our government is controlled by the fact that our elections aren't real, the scenario I just presented with Donald Trump being announced the winner, it's not going to get us out of that. The way we get out of that is by the television saying that Kamala Harris won the election by the biggest margin by which anyone has ever won an election. Make it as unbelievable as possible so that each and every American knows, including the Kamala Harris supporters, that our elections are fake. If you want to right the ship, that's how to do it. But people are scared of that option because beyond that point, all anyone can imagine is chaos. But I would suggest to you that the real chaos would be incurred for the rest of our lives if that election system remains in place and the global regime just continues to implement its agenda. The point is that in the court of public opinion, things have become narratively too big to rig. It is impossible to create the illusion of legitimacy for Kamala Harris or for any other uniparty candidates because it becomes so obvious that the elections are fake. People seem to imagine that if Donald Trump is announced the winner, we'll just celebrate while Donald Trump fixes everything. But he's not just going to have a magic wand. People believe that he would then expose the election system. But who's going to help him? And is he going to be able to get that done in the states? And then who's going to fix that problem? Where will the momentum be or the motivation? After everyone's been told Donald Trump won this very, very real election, the television announcing Donald Trump as the winner seems like the best case scenario to essentially all Republicans, all Trump supporters, even diehard MAGA. And I believe that's because, sadly, people still believe that the president is their God king. Whoever the TV says is the president is the source of all our joy and all our anguish. That person is responsible for everything. But that's not how it is. And it's not how it should be. And we shouldn't be focusing our lives around who's president. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying you can't expect a president, even a good one like Donald Trump, to just magically fix everything. He's going to need the people behind him to do that. The people are going to have to consent to all the things that need to be done to right the ship. And you can't do that eking out a close electoral college win while losing the popular vote in this very, very real election with the process of delegitimization and disqualification beginning the next day. And so I know it's counterintuitive. I know some people think it's crazy. I see people on Truth Social tell me that I'm some kind of traitor for suggesting that attempting to seize power by quote unquote winning a fake election is not the path to creating a just society. It's legitimately what the enemy does. Now, the reason I'm going through all that today is because I think that we're starting to see some of this take shape. Narratives that were seeded months ago or years ago are beginning to bloom. And in my opinion, understanding these narrative progressions is the best way to determine what comes next. And so today I want to support that theory a bit, and I want to start with a post from last night by Jack Posobiec. Now, there are plenty of people who don't like Jack Posobiec. because the Q Post said that Jack Posobiec was bad, or maybe they just find him annoying. Maybe they're bothered by the fact that he repurposes other people's content, including mine. But I just think he's an effective information operator, and I don't really care what his motivations are. He is somewhere way upstream disseminating narratives, and it's worth paying attention to. People know I love Steve Bannon. Posobiec is in Bannon's orbit, and so I pay attention to some of the things he says because he's influencing narratives. As I'm assuming all of you know, Donald Trump attended the Al Smith dinner in New York City last night. The entertainment portion of the evening features a comedian. Last night it was Jim Gaffigan. And then historically, the two presidential candidates will speak for a few minutes and roast one another. Most of you probably remember Donald Trump's appearance at the Al Smith dinner in 2016, where he roasted Hillary Clinton with a set of jokes that were absolutely devastating. You can watch it now. Hillary Clinton had all the things said to her face that the regime makes sure can never be allowed in any public conversation. It was a thing of beauty. Trump delivered another great performance last night. Kamala Harris didn't even bother to show up, basically cementing that Catholics are another one of those voting blocs that will be opposing the Democrat candidate in a way they never have before. But Posobiec posted this about the event. He quotes what he describes as a White House official, saying, "Lots of mega donors currently at the dinner are texting campaign leaders asking them if losing was always the plan, like in a serious way." And I thought, wow, that's very interesting. Mega donors at the Al Smith dinner are now wondering if the Democrats are actually trying to lose. Was that the plan? Was that why they just surreptitiously removed Joe Biden from the fake campaign and replaced him with a fake vice president who, when she ran for president, received no support from anyone? Were they planning to lose? Were they planning to lose when they didn't bother putting an agenda on Kamala Harris's website for months? Intentionally or not, most people can agree that Kamala Harris has been made to look like a fool. For whatever reason, people accept that she had moments of popularity toward the beginning of her fake campaign when she was doing the whole joy-based and vibes-based thing, when she was having her big, boisterous rallies before people realized that they were paying the same people to travel around the country attending her events. She chose a ridiculous, creepy running mate who's credibly accused of being a groomer, who is pretty flamboyantly gay, and whose backstory is falsified, a man who is unable to support the quote-unquote Harris agenda to the extent that there is one. You can just go down the line. It's a campaign set up to lose. Maybe they're just all incompetent, but if not, then there's some other motivation at play. Why would they want to lose? Well, who's really prepared to answer that besides basically us? That sort of idea wouldn't make sense anywhere else. Again, my position is that the best case scenario for the regime is that Trump is announced the winner. The delegitimization and disqualification process begins immediately. They fill up the rest of the federal government with uniparty members, the same in state governments and in local governments. And through announcing Trump as the winner, they create faith in the legitimacy of our elections, preserving the election fraud apparatus long into the future until they just tell us, oh yeah, you can't vote. We're just replacing it with AI. Well, here's Politico from Wednesday on the down-ballot part of this. Anti-Trump Republicans wade into key down-ballot races with Democratic endorsements. How about that? Prominent Republicans opposed to former President Donald Trump are beginning to throw their weight behind Democrats in key down-ballot races. So the Uniparty emerges. We're told Republicans and Democrats are like cats and dogs. They just don't mix. But it turns out they do mix. In fact, all the neoconservatives with little R's next to their name are simply a different brand of Marxist than their Uniparty Left pals with little D's next to their name. Donald Trump just called Lindsey Graham a progressive a few days ago. That was hilarious. But the Uniparty is showing itself because Uniparty Republicans want Donald Trump and MAGA removed just as much as the Uniparty Democrats. Topping the list, former Representative Liz Cheney, who backed Democrat Representative Susan Wild for re-election against State Representative Ryan McKenzie in the critical swing state of Pennsylvania on Wednesday, one day after she endorsed Democrat John Avlon's Long Island bid to unseat Representative Nick LaLota. John Avlon used to be a media figure. He was the editor of the Daily Beast and still appears on CNN. He's married to Herbert Hoover's great-granddaughter, Margaret Hoover, who is also a media figure. This election, we must look beyond partisanship to ensure we defeat election deniers and support people like Susan, who are serious leaders and will do what's right for their district and our nation, Cheney said in her endorsement of Wild in what's considered a toss-up race. Isn't that amazing? A close race in Pennsylvania. Liz Cheney just told you the purpose. We must defeat the election deniers. The only way to do that for real is to convince whoever might be the allies of election deniers that the election deniers are crazy and that the elections are just fine. Otherwise, the problem of election denial just grows for the regime. But Cheney wasn't alone. Former GOP Representative Denver Riggleman announced his support of Senator Tim Kaine's re-election bid against Republican Hung Cao in Virginia on Wednesday, saying the incumbent is thoughtful on policy and is willing to work across the aisle to deliver. So it's a uniparty campaign to support uniparty policy through unipartisan cooperation. Cheney, Riggleman, and former Representative Adam Kinzinger have all endorsed Kamala Harris's presidential bid against Donald Trump, but their support of Democrats further down the ballot is new. The three are among the most visible and recently serving former GOP lawmakers to throw their support behind Democrats in federal races. Kinzinger has also backed Representative Colin Allred's bid to unseat Senator Ted Cruz, as well as Avlon in his Long Island race. The question to consider here is, even if the regime is unable to create the illusion of legitimacy for a Kamala Harris victory, if that's even something they would want to do, is it possible they could create the illusion of legitimacy for candidates down ballot? Could they sell the country on the idea that while voters wanted a change from the Biden-Harris administration, they also wanted a check on Donald Trump's power? They decided Donald Trump was the lesser of two evils, but they didn't want to give him the House and Senate, and they didn't want to support other MAGA candidates. What they wanted was divided government. Let's go to the New York Times. This is David Brooks from yesterday. Why the heck isn't she running away with this? And it's funny because you are already deeply embedded to even accept the premise of that headline that Kamala Harris is up or could be up or should be up. David Brooks is one of the New York Times token, quote unquote, conservatives, but he's really just a neocon leftist like the rest of them. Two big things baffle me about this election. The first is, why are the polls so immobile? The polls. In mid-June, the race between President Biden and Donald Trump was neck and neck. Since then, we've had a blizzard of big events, and still the race is basically where it was in June. It started out tied and has only gotten closer. Well, that's weird. Didn't you guys change candidates? And didn't Joe Biden's polling collapse after his debate performance? Isn't that why you changed candidates? We supposedly live in a country in which a plurality of voters are independents. You'd think they'd behave, well, independently and get swayed by events. But no, in our era, the polling numbers barely move. It's mind-blowing to me that something like this could happen, and they don't think, hey, maybe those fake polls are fake. Or hey, maybe the idea that independents represent a plurality in this country is mistaken. Or even perhaps that maybe people have become independents because they hate both political parties. And when that's the case, the most obvious answer is Donald Trump and MAGA. The next most obvious answer would be RFK Jr., and RFK Jr. now supports Trump and MAGA. But regardless, the polls are fake, and his entire argument is based on the polls being real. You cannot accept the false reality as real and expect to find success in reality prime. The second thing that baffles me is, why has politics been 50-50 for over a decade? We've had big shifts in the electorate. college-educated voters going left and non-college-educated voters going right. But still, the two parties are almost exactly evenly matched. Yeah, David Brooks, what could possibly explain something like that? He goes on. This is not historically normal. Usually we have one majority party that has a big vision for the country, and then we have a minority party that tries to poke holes in that vision. In the 1930s, the Democrats dominated with the New Deal, and the Republicans complained. In the 1980s, the Reagan Revolution dominated, and the Democrats tried to adjust. But today, neither party has been able to expand its support to create that kind of majority coalition. As the American Enterprise Institute scholars Rui Teixeira and Yuval Levin note in a new study, Politics Without Winners, we have two parties playing the role of minority party. Each party runs campaigns focused almost entirely on the faults of the other, with no serious strategy for significantly broadening its electoral reach. And of course, at a neocon think tank like the American Enterprise Institute, telling the truth about Donald Trump is not an option. Donald Trump has broadened his electoral reach. So does it matter whether or not Yuval Levin and Rui Teixeira can determine what his plan was or is? Was that just some magical occurrence? Virtually every demographic that made up the Democrat Party base has shifted in Donald Trump's direction. The only Republicans that have gone the other way are neocons, the never-Trumper Lincoln Project types of people. Teixeira and Levin observe that both parties are content to live with deadlock. The parties, they write, have prioritized the wishes of their most intensely devoted voters, who would never vote for the other party, over the priorities of winnable voters who could go either way. Both parties treat narrow victories like landslides and wave away narrow defeats, somehow seeing both as confirmation of their existing strategies. Trump has spent the last 9 years not even trying to expand his base, but just playing to the same MAGA grievances over and over again. Hey, Kami, those aren't MAGA grievances. Those are the American people's grievances. And the plan to expand the electoral reach is addressing those grievances. And that's the thing that's worked. If the New York Times and AEI haven't realized that yet, it's not Donald Trump's fault. Kamala Harris refuses to break with Biden on any significant issue and is running as a paint-by-numbers orthodox Democrat. Neither party tolerates much ideological diversity. Neither party has a plausible strategy to build a durable majority coalition. Why? All right, so we have a set of false premises. Let's see where he takes it. I think the reason for all this is that political parties no longer serve the function they used to. In days gone by, parties were political organizations designed to win elections and gain power. Party leaders would expand their coalitions toward that end. Today, on the other hand, in an increasingly secular age, political parties are better seen as religious organizations that exist to provide believers with meaning, membership, and moral sanctification. If that's your purpose, of course, you have to stick to the existing gospel. You have to focus your attention on affirming the creed of the current true believers. You get so buried within the walls of your own catechism, you can't even imagine what it would be like to think outside it. When parties were primarily political organizations, they were led by elected officials and party bosses. Now that parties are more like quasi-religions, power lies with priesthood, the dispersed array of media figures, podcast hosts, and activists who run the conversation, define party orthodoxy, and determine the boundaries of acceptable belief. And what a fabulous point to make in an era of censorship and propaganda. Let's look at the Democrat Party. The Democrats have huge advantages in America today. Unlike their opponents, they are not a threat to democracy. Voters trust them on issues like health care and are swinging their way on issues like abortion. They have a great base from which to potentially expand their coalition and build their majority. All they have to do is address their weaknesses, the places where they are out of step with most Americans. The problem is that where you find their weaknesses, there you find the priesthood. The public conversation on the Democratic side of things is dominated by highly educated urban progressives who work in academia, media, the activist groups, and so on. These folks have a highly developed and self-confident worldview, a comprehensive critique of American society. The only problem is that this worldview is rejected by most Americans who don't share the critique. The more the Democrats embrace the priesthood's orthodoxy, the more it loses working-class voters, including Hispanic and Black working-class voters. For example, the progressive priesthood, quite admirably, is committed to fighting racial oppression. Its members believe that the way to do that is to be hyper-aware of racial categories in the diversity, equity, and inclusion way, in order to rearrange preferences to support historically oppressed groups. And maybe this is an opportune time to note that on Wednesday's live stream, in a discussion about the roots of neoconservatism, I highlighted an article from the Times of Israel this past May with the headline, "How Jewish is Neoconservatism?" The article mentions David Brooks saying, while describing the many conspiracy theories about neocons, which he had encountered, David Brooks famously quipped, "Con is short for conservative and neo is short for Jewish." So that's why he shares the progressive focus on supporting historically oppressed groups. Most Americans also seek to fight racism, but they do it in a different way. Their goal is to reduce the salience of racial categories so that people's talents and initiative determine their life outcomes. And it should be clear that David Brooks does not agree with most Americans on that. According to a 2022 University of Southern California survey of Americans, 92% of respondents agreed with this statement. Our goal as a society should be to treat all people the same without regard to the color of their skin, which is why only a third of Americans in a recent Pew Research Center survey said they supported using race as a factor in college admissions. Man, this guy loves polls. Or take energy. Most members of the Democrat clerisy are properly alarmed by climate change and believe we should rapidly shift from fossil fuels. Liberal white college graduates favor eliminating fossil fuels by 2-1. It's no skin off their teeth. They work on laptops. David Brooks, neoconservative, alarmed by climate change. But if you live in Oklahoma or work in an industry that runs on oil, coal, or natural gas, this idea seems like an assault on your way of life, which of course it is. An overwhelming 72% of Americans favor an all-of-the-above approach, relying on both renewables and traditional energy sources. Or take immigration. Highly educated white progressives tend to see the immigration and asylum issue through the lens of oppressor and oppressed. The people coming across the border are fleeing horror in their home countries. But most Americans see immigration through a law and order lens. We need to control our boundaries, preserve social order, and take care of our own. In a June CBS survey, 62% of Americans, including 53% of Hispanics, said they supported a program to deport undocumented immigrants, the most extreme version of this approach. And just as a quick tangent, I hope everyone understands that each and every appeal to a polling figure is an appeal to authority. You are saying this person, this entity, this organization, this study is correct about this thing. They have made this a fact based on their authority of their process. These are quote unquote scientific polls, which mean they have to be facts because they're science. But they're not facts, and they're not science, and they can't stand in for an argument. At best, they're information among other information, but the truth is they're not even that because they're not real. Every point he's making depends on polling. On these and so many other issues, the position that is held by a vast majority of Americans is unsayable in highly educated progressive circles. The priesthood has established official doctrine, and woe to anyone who contradicts it. The Republicans have the exact same dynamic, except their priesthood is dominated by shock jocks, tech bros, and Christian nationalists, some of whom are literally members of the priesthood. What is this guy talking about? Harris clearly understands the problem. She has tried to run her campaign to show she is in tune with majority opinions. In a classic 2018 More in Common report, only 45% of the most liberal group in the survey said they were proud to be American. But Harris festooned her convention with patriotic symbols to the rafters. She's now explicitly running on the theme country before party. Yeah, David Brooks, but no one actually believes that because we weren't all just born yesterday. And how many polls does this guy read? But in just the few months she has had to campaign, Harris can't turn around the Democrat Party's entire identity. Plus, her gestures have all been stylistic. Oh, that's better. She hasn't challenged Democrat orthodoxy on any substantive issue. Finally, candidates no longer have the ultimate power over what the party stands for. The priesthood, the people who dominate the national conversation, has the power. Hey, David, let us know if you figure out who the priesthood is that globalists and neocons like yourself bow to, because I bet you'd find a lot of overlap with the people controlling agendas on both sides of the Uniparty. The result is that each party has its own metaphysics. Each party is no longer just a political organism. It is a political, cultural, religious class entity that organizes the social, moral, and psychological lives of its believers. Again, this is just babble and nonsense. His entire description of the Republicans is that they're dominated by shock jocks, tech bros, and Christian nationalists. Those people might be guiding public sentiment among standard issue villagers on the Uniparty Right, but they don't represent Trump. They don't represent MAGA. And so they aren't the power center in any way. This is delusional stuff. Each party's metaphysics seem to grow more rigid and impermeable as time goes by. Sometimes it seems that Harris is running not to be president of the United States, but to be president of a theme park called Democrat Magic Mountain, while Trump is running to be president of Republican Fantasy Island. Wow, that's so cute and descriptive. What clever and colorful imagery. Each party has become too narcissistic to get outside its own head and try to build a coalition with people outside the camp of true believers. You have to be a heavily vaccinated, COVID superfan, central narrative addicted, science loving, elite wannabe to even consider writing a sentence like that. It is not at all an exaggeration to say that Donald Trump has created the biggest political movement in this country's history. That wouldn't be possible if he and MAGA were not able to attract outsiders. You can't fly around the country holding rallies in front of tens of thousands of supporters if you're not able to attract outsiders. You can't bring disaffected Democrats and independents into the fold if you can't attract outsiders. Only a few paragraphs remaining. Let's close this out. The political problem for Harris is that there are a lot more Americans without a college degree than with one. Class is growing more salient in American life, with Hispanic and Black working class voters shifting steadily over to the working class party, the GOP. The problem for Trump is that he is even better at repelling potential converts than the Democrats. He'd be winning landslides if he had tried to wedge MAGA Republicans into a coalition with Bush-McCain Republicans, but he's incapable of that. Well, no, David, he's not incapable of that. We just don't want or need that. The point is to defeat all the worst people in our country, not to acquiesce and join them. The problem for the rest of us is that we are locked into this perpetual state of suspended animation in which the two parties are deadlocked and nothing ever changes. I keep running into people who are rooting for divided government for the next 4 years. It will mean that America will be able to do little to solve its problems. They see this as the least bad option. And how about that? He just made the exact argument. He ignored the reality about Donald Trump and MAGA throughout. He created a reality based on fake polls. He pretended Donald Trump is not attracting outsiders when he's attracting more outsiders than any political campaign in my lifetime by far. And his very serious intellectual conclusion is that we are a 50-50 country, deadlocked. It's a close race because people feel like neither candidate really represents them. That's what we're supposed to believe. What is his support for that argument? Fake polling and the way things have always been. They want divided government because that's the only way to protect the country from Trump's worst impulses. Otherwise, he's going to end our democracy. And no one wants to see that except for maybe Donald Trump and his MAGA base, which can't expand at all. And if it was expanding, the polls would show it. It's like every bit of the complete and total farce that is the central narrative exists to support the outcome I described. And to be clear, I'm not saying they will get that outcome. I'm not saying that is what will actually happen. I'm saying that's what they want. That's what they have set in place. That's what they think they're going to get. And so they are developing narratives around that outcome so that people will understand it when it is given to them, causing them to act in ways they have already been trained and conditioned to act. They will have an explanation prepared for them as to why Donald Trump was reported the winner, even though MAGA candidates and far-right Republicans lost down ballot. The American people wanted divided government because neither party really represents them, but they were just getting sick of the Biden and Harris thing, and they wanted Donald Trump's economy back. They just didn't want everything that went along with it. These are the stories we're going to hear in that scenario. Now, last Thursday, in an episode called No Transition, we talked about a CNN article about how the Trump team had not engaged the illegitimate administration's bureaucratic state to cooperate in the so-called transition process. This is from today in Politico. Trump considers bucking presidential transition system. Former President Trump is weighing a go-it-alone approach to presidential transition planning, which could dramatically slow his takeover of the federal government if he wins in November. The Trump transition team has yet to sign 2 agreements with the federal government to receive transition funding and planning assistance and to share information, a break with modern precedent. Instead, transition co-chairs Linda McMahon, who served as small business administrator in the Trump administration, and investor and GOP megadonor Howard Lutnick are plowing ahead with their own processes for vetting potential political appointees and preparing policy plans. The decision not to take federal assistance allows them to raise unlimited funds without disclosing their donors, while avoiding oversight from federal bureaucrats whom Trump and his advisors deeply distrust. But if Trump wins the election and continues to drag his feet on signing the agreement with the White House, it will limit the information he and his team can access to understand current federal operations and challenges. While the Trump transition team insists it will be ready to hit the ground running if the former president wins, experts say it's likely to further set back its preparations, already running well behind schedule, to take over the executive branch and its millions of employees. Wow, it's like they don't even care about that entire bureaucratic administrative state. Not working with federal transition coordinators adds another degree of difficulty to executing the transition because there's so many points of interaction with the executive branch, said Rich Bagger, former chief of staff to Chris Christie and former executive director for Trump's pre-election 2016 transition. There's all this serious work that needs to take place that, it just seemed to me, was facilitated by being fully integrated into the transition structure, says Rich Bagger. Beyond simply planning the future president's policy agenda, a presidential transition is charged with identifying candidates to fill thousands of vacancies, readying plans to run the federal government's voluminous agencies, and applying for security clearances for staff to receive sensitive information. The Presidential Transition Act aims to facilitate a smooth transfer of power between administrations, establishing guidelines for the sitting government's transition planning and designating various forms of assistance that the General Services Administration can provide to the presidential transitions and, post-election, the president-elect. By September 1st, the GSA is expected to reach an agreement with the candidates' teams regarding what kind of support and facilities it will provide before the election. By October 1st, the White House is expected to reach an agreement with the candidates' teams around access to agencies post-election, which includes an ethics plan for its staff. And let's just pause for a second and consider why these people would be fretting about something like this. They certainly don't care about the government being effectively run by a new president who comes into power if that president doesn't represent the Uniparty. We saw what they did during Trump's first term, this bureaucratic administrative state, these federal agencies that come under the purview of the executive branch only served to undermine Donald Trump for those 4 years. So they don't care about helping Donald Trump, the duly elected president, implement his agenda. Last week, I suggested they might be doing this to preserve their own jobs, to keep themselves and their agencies viable. But at this point, I have to wonder if there weren't plans to undermine Donald Trump, not only in his campaign, but potentially to spy on the Trump operation as they did in 2016 and to leak information to the press. This transition process is beginning to seem like one of those weapons that they use to destroy whoever they perceive as the enemy. Under that current system, the campaigns are not required to accept the assistance, but up until now, none has declined it. While Vice President Kamala Harris's transition team has reached agreements with the federal government to receive assistance both pre- and post-election, including office space and funding for its current transition planning, the Trump transition has blown through both deadlines to engage with the federal government. A person involved in the Trump transition said they are exploring a spectrum of legal options for working with the current administration, including signing and not signing the GSA agreements and the potential implications. In a statement, Trump transition co-chairs McMahon and Lutnick said conversations with the federal government are ongoing, and they continue to plan to staff the next administration and devise policy initiatives. The Trump-Vance transition lawyers continue to constructively engage with the Biden-Harris administration lawyers regarding all agreements contemplated by the Presidential Transition Act, they said. Any suggestion to the contrary is false and intentionally misleading. Saloni Sharma, a White House spokesperson, confirmed in a statement, "To date, we have entered into an MOU with the Harris transition team outlining such conditions. The federal transition coordinator is actively working with the Trump transition team to complete an MOU." And Channing Great, a spokesperson for the GSA, said they are, quote, "prepared to provide services to the Trump transition team once an MOU is executed and services are accepted," which would cover things like office space, equipment, communications, and IT services. There are a number of reasons the Trump transition team may not want to accept the GSA's help or funding. Resources like free office space provided to the campaigns under the GSA agreement are less valuable when people are used to working remotely. And by not accepting funding from the federal government, the team may collect unlimited contributions from private donors without disclosing their identities. That money can be spent on salaries for transition staff who in years past have often served on a volunteer basis. By not signing the agreement with the White House, which provides access to the agencies, the Trump transition can also avoid submitting an ethics pledge, whose requirements are outlined by the Presidential Transition Act. And again, it sounds like they are upset that Trump is not handing them weapons that they can use against him. McMahon and Lutnick noted in their statement that their staff have already signed a robust ethics pledge that they drafted per Presidential Transition Act stipulations. Among the requirements outlined by the Trump-Vance Transition Ethics Code, which was first reported by the New York Times, is that anyone who has engaged in, quote, regulated lobbying activities with respect to such matter as defined by the Lobbying Disclosure Act within the previous 12 months, end quote, is disqualified from participating in the transition. The Harris transition requires that people who have registered as federal lobbyists in the last year receive approval from the Office of General Counsel. Really sounds like Trump's approach is better there. Trump allies also harbor distrust of the executive branch, according to two people familiar with their thinking. Gosh, I wonder why. Trump's 2016 transition alleged that special counsel Robert Mueller improperly obtained their communications from the GSA amid his probe into Russian interference in the election. Ken Nahagian, who became executive director of the 2016 Trump transition after the election, argued the existing GSA process was particularly onerous and restrictive without many advantages. Raising money was particularly difficult with the $5,000 limit on contributions, and the GSA also required the disclosure of the transition's donors, he added. Dejected has recommended to those around the Trump campaign or transition that they reject the GSA's support. You have to follow all the GSA rules to a T. It's very onerous, Dejected said, adding, people cost money. He argued, moreover, there is still plenty of time to coordinate the 2024 transition. Those involved in planning for a Trump transition, something the former president is superstitious about, have also expressed confidence in their ability to put together a menu of policies and political appointees. So it's just Trump's superstitions. It's his paranoia that is going to cause all these government problems. You're going to see the greatest set of talent ever walk on the field on January 20th, Lutnick, who is overseeing the personnel vetting process, told Bloomberg News on Wednesday. We have 5,000 people already who we know who have been vetted by the greatest people like Ross Perot in energy and Chuck Schwab doing finance and everybody. They are helping and building for Donald Trump, the greatest team. But Trump's previous transition to the White House illustrates the risks of not coordinating with the government. Under Christie and Bagger, the 2016 transition signed its first agreement with the federal government months before the election and was working on obtaining security clearances and setting up processes for the Office of Government Ethics for potential nominees, Bagger said. The security clearance process seems to be another focus for these people fretting about the transition process. Donald Trump, as president, has the unilateral authority to approve, deny, and revoke security clearances. So why would he need to submit all the names of people he's thinking about bringing into the administration to the bureaucratic administrative state to perform the process of security clearances? Additionally, the GSA provided important information technology for cyber protection, he recalled, this being Bagger. GSA also provides the transition team with government email addresses. Federal agencies are not required to share information with .com or .org email addresses, whose security may be unknown, explained Valerie Smith Boyd, director of the Center for Presidential Transition, a nonpartisan resource for presidential candidates. And, of course, nonpartisan, like bipartisan, only means unipartisan. We've already seen hacking attempts in this election cycle, and of course, the .gov addresses also help federal agencies understand that, yes, these individuals that you're communicating with are official representatives of the candidate, she said. If the candidate does not have .gov email addresses, will federal agencies have to brief only in person? Would they have to offer standalone computers that are not connected to a network? Would they have to provide go back to paper binders full of material? Man, this lady sounds like she is really on it. Thank goodness. For the Trump 2016 transition, the complications started after Election Day, when Christie was ousted as the transition team chief. The new transition officials failed to complete the paperwork for the second transition agreement with the administration, allowing it to receive briefings and information from federal agencies until mid-November. One former Trump administration official recalled how the initial White House was particularly slow at hiring and had a bare-bones operation for a few months. Transition experts warn that the launch of the next Trump White House could be severely impaired if the Trump transition continues to delay or potentially decline to sign the agreements in the months before inauguration. They're going to walk onto the stage with almost grotesque incapacities, said Terry Sullivan, executive director of the White House Transition Project and professor emeritus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They're going to come in with incredible arrogance, and so they're going to be incredibly ignorant of what they need to know. And that guy sounds downright panicked. The Trump team is not going to be able to operate effectively with the bureaucratic administrative state? Oh no. Maybe they're refusing to participate in this transition process because they're attempting to minimize their exposure to the underhanded tactics of the deep state, but maybe it's because they don't need the transition process, because no real transition is required. I guess we'll see. But whatever it is, has them awfully freaked out. Here is MSNBC's Joy Reid, followed by MSNBC's Donnie Deutsch.
Donald Trump does win. There won't be Democrats go back and figure out how to get more voters and figure out how to change your positions. There will be camps. There will be Project 2025. There could be arrests of people like Adam Schiff. There could be Nancy Pelosi being hauled off to jail. And if you don't think that that's possible, then you really don't understand that there is no American exceptionalism. We're just a country like every other country. My father lived under Mobutu Sese Seko. If you ran against Mobutu Sese Seko's party, you went to jail. That happened in my father's lifetime. Maduro is putting people in jail if on your WhatsApp they find that you're saying things against Maduro. That's happening right now in our neighboring country that wants to invade my mother's country, Guyana, because they have oil. These are happening in our neighborhood. There is no, our democracy is much more like a Latin American democracy than it is like England or Germany or any part of Europe. We are a Latin American country. So everything you see happen in Brazil, Venezuela, it all can happen here. So there isn't going to be an opportunity for Vice President Harris to be the bigger party because we will be fighting for our survival as a democracy, and some people will be fighting for their actual survival. So I think the question misses the point, because if Kamala Harris doesn't win, it's not clear there will be another election. So that's the stakes, unfortunately.
As we all talk to a lot of people who vote for Trump, and I say to them, and I still can't figure out, do they not believe it or do they not care? Do they not understand that our freedom is on the line? Do they not get that, or do they just not care? Do they take freedom for granted at this point? When you hear Mark Milley, a man who has served this country, a great man, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, literally say, who's been in the room with him and say, he is a fascist to the core. He is a danger to America. Do they think he's making that up? Do they just so care about their 3% tax cut? What is it? And I challenge people, and I say, you do understand that he will turn on this country, and he will turn us into Hungary. Do you not understand the freedoms that started, as you brought it up? It started with Roe v. Wade. It will continue. It will continue by putting his enemies in jail. It will continue on having unfree media. Are there people around this table that are really worried? Rev, are you worried going forward that you're on a list if Donald Trump is elected? Yes or no?
I'm convinced I'll be on the list.
I am too.
I don't know how we're not going to be.
And think about that. This is America. This is the United States of America. And people in the media, like the Rev, have to be concerned that they may be on a list. I have people saying to me, Donnie, are you worried? This is America. And yet people will still give permission.
Now that there is pure unbridled panic. Also, you have to love how Joy Reid mentioned Venezuela taking back Guyana from the global regime. She said Maduro would invade Guyana, much like Putin invaded Ukraine, and much like we'll hear Xi is invading Taiwan. But it's all the same thing, and if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you've heard me make these arguments for a long time. Maduro is going to make Guyana part of Venezuela, or at least the Essequibo region of Guyana. Well, yeah. The same pattern is repeating all across the world. Let's head back over to Politico. This is from Tuesday, and we'll close on this. They're so vindictive. Why some federal employees are fearing Trump 2.0. EPA employees are shuffling to quote-unquote safer agencies. An Interior Department worker is putting off buying a new car and poring over Project 2025. And civil servants across the government are worried they might soon get fired. I got to say, it's actually kind of funny thinking about these federal employees poring over Project 2025, even though it's not Donald Trump's agenda. They've just been so convinced by the television that it is. They want to see what the potential future for their agency might be. Hey, federal employees, spend your time looking for new jobs in the private sector. Your agencies are not going to exist. Federal employees throughout the executive branch are panicking at the thought of another Trump administration. Former President Trump has pledged to, quote unquote, demolish the deep state. His running mate, Ohio Republican Senator J.D. Vance, has said Trump ought to fire, quote, every civil servant in the administrative state, end quote. It's not just campaign trail bluster. In the waning days of his first administration, Trump sought to make it easier to fire federal employees, a move that was quickly reversed by the Biden administration. Workers in some agencies are particularly distraught about a possible Trump return. The former president and his allies have singled out certain agencies, including those that issue environmental rules, as prime targets, should he return to office in January. Climate, clean energy, and conservation programs scaled up and burnished with cash during the Biden administration are certain to be lightning rods for Trump and his team. That's looming large over energy and environmental workers who are feeling the pressure on a professional level as they're hustling to get Biden's priorities wrapped up in the coming months. It's also hitting them personally as they fear they might soon be out of a job. And you have to love how they note that during the Biden administration, these federal agencies were scaled up and burnished with cash. They printed money from nothing and wasted it on strengthening the bureaucratic administrative state to make it harder for Donald Trump to dismantle. I will leave it up to you to decide whether that is a worse use of government funds than the money they give to illegal aliens or the money they send to wage the fake foreign proxy wars. The prospect of a Trump return is shaping how one Interior employee and their spouse, another federal worker, are handling their finances. We have stopped doing any money-spending things because what if we are without jobs in the next year? The Interior employee said. We need all the savings we can get. Man, I really feel for these people. I really do. The reason is because I know what that's like, having had my career of 15 years ended with a snap of Gavin Newsom's fingers, ostensibly to protect us all from the very deadly pandemic. I don't recall hearing that the federal bureaucracy and its employees had to deal with that problem. Didn't they just go home and work remotely? The couple has put off buying a new car and paying for needed home repairs, that person said. We're both feeling the heaviness of this right now. Oh gosh, the horror. They can't buy a new car? That employee and others interviewed for this story spoke to Politico's E&E News on condition of anonymity because they feared retaliation if a Trump administration takes over in January. They're so vindictive. I can see them going back through E&E News articles and saying, "You're fired," the Interior employee said. Neither the Trump nor the Harris campaign responded to requests for comment for this story. At EPA, there's a feeling that employees there will be, quote, specifically targeted during a Trump administration in the future, end quote, said Nicole Cantello, president of American Federation of Government Employees, Local 704, which represents workers in EPA's Chicago-based regional office. So the president of a public sector union branch for a massive federal government bureaucratic agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, first off, public sector unions should not exist because it's basically the federal government negotiating against itself, where what's being negotiated is how much additional money to extract from taxpayers. So it's really just two parts of the government colluding to take more from the people and claiming it's to protect workers. Let's continue. That's led to a, quote, significant amount of movement of employees out of EPA into what would be called safer agencies, Cantello said. She's noted a recent trend of staff leaving EPA to move to other agencies, including the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce. Those agencies, quote, are not so much under the microscope, end quote, and were not so, quote, explicitly attacked by the previous Trump administration, end quote. She attributes the job moves to worries that it's not clear who's going to win this election and the risk to EPA employees who stick around if Trump returns to office. It's, quote, in the back of everybody's mind, end quote, that a Trump administration might purge the federal workforce, said one employee at the National Science Foundation. And you have to love how they're going around to all the most useless government agencies. People are worried But anybody who has half a brain is existentially afraid for the safety of democracy, that person said. At the moment, quote, people are very concerned with their day-to-day jobs and are working to make sure they can get a lot of good done now. A lot of good on behalf of whom? It can't be the American people who support Donald Trump and his agenda and don't support the expansion of the administrative state, and certainly not the National Science Foundation. This person is basically admitting to attempting to undermine the Trump administration on behalf of the global regime agenda. The people collectively are concluding that these agencies aren't actually getting a lot of good done in their names. There was a prevailing feeling of doom and gloom among government employees before Biden dropped out of the presidential race, said the Interior employee. Harris's entrance into the race brought a sense of relief for some civil servants who thought she stood a better chance at beating Trump, the employee added. And of course, we have to call them civil servants if they work in government, which is a clever euphemism to make them sound more helpful and valuable than they are. That person would be much more comfortable with Harris in the White House, they said. But they don't see her victory as a given, although she's had an edge in some recent polls. And good job, Politico. You always have to remind your readers that it's a very close race and Harris has a great chance of winning. I just don't trust the polls after Hillary Clinton, the Interior employee said. Fed's fears about Trump are justified, said Representative Jerry Connolly, a Virginia Democrat whose district is packed with government employees. Federal employees are rightly concerned about what a second Trump presidency will mean for them and, by extension, for the American people they so dutifully serve, Connolly said. Trump, quote, has pledged to fire or relocate more than 100,000 federal employees who live and work in the D.C. region. He has repeatedly and shamelessly mocked the work of career experts and scientists, going so far as to scrub references to climate change from government websites. He has even promised to abolish entire government agencies that do not sufficiently bend themselves to his whims, Connolly said. What Connolly does not mention is that is well in the purview of the president to do. These agencies don't have a right to exist. These federal employees don't have a right to jobs. I might be more sympathetic, but the federal bureaucracy has been destroying the lives of the American people and destroying businesses for decade after decade after decade. Trump and his allies, some of whom are still fuming over Fed's pushback during his first administration, are eager to make changes. Senior energy and environmental appointees who served in the Trump administration have been vocal about their frustrations with civil servants when they were in office. Trump-era Interior Secretary David Bernhardt penned a book after leaving office titled, You Report to Me, Accountability for the Failing Administrative State, where he expressed concerns with the civil service. And Trump's former EPA Chief of Staff, Mandy Gunasekera, recently released a book that criticizes the civil service called Y'all Fired, a Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. In it, she suggested moving the agency's headquarters to Florida or Texas. Gunasekera wrote the EPA section of Project 2025, a playbook organized by the Conservative Heritage Foundation. She wrote that EPA's, quote, current activities and staffing levels far exceeded its congressional mandates and purpose, end quote. And that would mean, as confirmed by the Supreme Court multiple times over the past couple of years, that makes them unconstitutional. Trump has sought to distance himself from Project 2025 on the campaign trail, but his record as president and his comments during this campaign signal that environmental agencies would be on the chopping block. He floated cuts to the Interior Department and to environmental agencies more broadly earlier this year. For now, government employees are scouring the 922-page Project 2025 document for clues about their futures if Trump wins. Every federal employee I know is reading Project 2025, said the Interior employee. And the funny thing is, Project 2025 would be a more hopeful future for these people. As the Biden administration draws to a close, agency officials have been putting in overtime to wrap up their work, Cantello said. We are seeing an increase as a union in overtime and comp time given out for people who are working more than 40 hours a week, Cantello said. Does that generate faith in the federal government, the usefulness of these employees, the integrity of these employees or their organizations? It doesn't instill faith as far as I'm concerned. That sounds like they are siphoning off the public coffers to create a buffer for when their jobs are eliminated. Sounds like they're basically just stealing from the taxpayers. That includes work on things like the massive climate law known as the Inflation Reduction Act, she said, as well as the air and water rules that, quote, the agency is trying to get out before a possible Trump administration takes office. They're trying to put new rules in place as they're on the way out the door? Why would anyone want these people to have any power whatsoever? And again, you got to love Politico just admitting that the Inflation Reduction Act is actually a massive climate law. There's a sense at EPA that we're all running to catch the train right now before it leaves the station, Cantello said. There's a ton of money at stake. EPA has obligated $29.1 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act so far, said EPA spokesperson Nick Conger. The agency is on track to obligate nearly $38.3 billion from the law by the end of this calendar year. And apparently we're supposed to view that as some kind of achievement. They're trying to spend money as fast as they can to shore up all the special interests that will be affected when Donald Trump dismantles the administrative state. The climate crisis requires immediate action, Conger said. Communities are suffering from pollution. EPA is focused on responding to these challenges with urgency. Doesn't sound like that. Sounds like you're just raiding the federal coffers. Trump, meanwhile, has said he wants to stop climate spending in its tracks. He pledged on the campaign trail to rescind unspent cash from Biden's signature climate law. And yes, that's called rescission. Donald Trump has said he will use the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 in order to do that. Doing so would be complicated, and Trump would face challenges holding back spending that Congress has approved. But Trump would have several possible avenues to try and block or stall spending on the Biden administration's $1.6 trillion in climate, energy, and infrastructure initiatives. So we're being told that the Uniparty is going to fight against Donald Trump as he tries to make sure that more American taxpayer money is not wasted on these agencies and their projects. We're supposed to think that's bad or unjust or scary somehow. Less than 17% of the $1.1 trillion those laws provided for direct investments on climate, energy, and infrastructure had been spent as of April. Wow, less than 17%. I wonder how much of the infrastructure has actually been built. A Trump return is, quote, a possibility and an eventuality, but it's not real yet, said one longtime EPA employee who has experienced past presidential transitions. Everybody's just kind of focusing on the mission right now, that person said. We've still got a lot of work to do under this administration. Now, I assume that this article was meant to create sympathy for these people, but I don't think it achieved that goal. In fact, it only made them look desperate and greedy, as if their real job is just control and influence and money laundering. It's strange, but probably necessary, to hear them admit that their goal is to spend as much money as possible before the spigot is turned off. And so let's bring it all back around. If the TV says on November 5th, or maybe November 6th, or maybe November 8th, or 10th, or 15th, that Donald Trump has, quote unquote, won a fake election, people will be overjoyed. But that can't be the final victory. That would just be the next step in attempting to solve all of these problems. And let's say Donald Trump was able to solve all of them in 4 years. But he wasn't able to remove the election fraud apparatus. He wasn't able to guarantee legitimate elections in this country. And he's not even able to sincerely pursue it because that would be to question his own legitimacy. And the supporters, they'd be convinced that the elections are already legitimate, and they would have to attest to that to claim that Donald Trump won. Through doing that, they would also be attesting to the legitimacy of all the candidates down ballot as well. And if the election fraud apparatus is not removed, if we're not guaranteed legitimate elections in the future, then even if Donald Trump fixed this problem and dismantled the administrative state, it would just come right back. And what then? Where is Donald Trump to save us then? What would we do then? Just complain that the elections are illegitimate and continue down this same path? Perhaps people just don't want to move forward because it's scary. Because moving forward means you have to admit that something foundational is wrong. It requires us to admit that we've been wrong about things, often really important things, things that had we known we were wrong, we would have lived our lives in different ways. And so we think that changing course, which requires backtracking all the way, would mean that everything before was a waste. But that's not what it means. The only way to make it so that everything before was a waste is if we refuse to change while knowing we're headed in the wrong direction. However much we think our worlds are going to be changed and disrupted, there are people out there who haven't even started thinking about this process. They have no idea anything could even change, but it's coming to them the same as it's coming to everyone else. We're the ones prepared for it. We should welcome it, not only because we're prepared for it, but because it's the right thing and the only path forward. It might be scary, but it's not as scary as continuing to grovel and tremble over who the television tells us is our next God King. I will be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.